Hi there, good evening. Today I want to speak to you. This is Dr. Tom Knotts, and I want to speak to you on the subject of polyfragmentation. This is for my friend Michelle. And so let's go ahead and get right into it. There are many people that counsel, I mean, they're a dime for 20 dozen these days, and people that think they know what they're doing in counseling dissociative conditions, in counseling, any myriad of mental illness or problems. But they really don't understand the mechanics. And it's like having a computer or a brain box for an automobile. Unless you know how it's designed, you won't know how to fix it. You won't even know what the problem is. Polyfragmentation is not disassociation. It is totally different than disassociation. Dissociative conditions, and in my book, the complete big book of dissociation identity disorder, which is book 1 and 2 combined, I talk about 6 types of disassociation. But see, disassociation happens when the brain has too much, TOO, um, an insult to the psyche, too much duress, neglect can cause disassociation, leaving somebody alone. Trauma can cause disassociation. Anytime the brain is unable to deal with something prior to the age of 7, in other words, the frontal lobes have not been fully developed. The personal identity has not been created yet. So, in other words, for a person to disassociate, they have to be younger than the age of 7, or they can't have the fully developed frontal lobes. The amygdala, the hippocampus can't be activated. Once the personality or the personal identity is developed around the age of 7, if that person hasn't disassociated, they won't. What will be called is when they get through a traumatic experience, it'll be called post-traumatic stress syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders. It'll create complexities, but not dissociative states. So, for instance, dissociative amnesia, dissociative personality disorder, they have to happen before the frontal lobes are fully developed. Now, with polyfragmentation, it has to begin much earlier than that. Polyfragmentation is not something that happens because of an event or, shall we say, accidentally. Dissociative conditions happen because of events. They happen because a child is going through something too stressful for them to deal with. And in order for the mind to continue, allowing the child not only to live, but also to thrive, because there's a drive. It's basically a synergy, and it's called the stress reflex system within the brain. You have to have a certain amount of stress, but you can't overtax it, or it'll snap the mind. So to keep that from happening, the mind from snapping, the brain will disassociate, create a separate modeling system, which basically is a storage system, and it will place all the memories of that event that caused it to be too excessive into that. Now, that is simple disassociation. And on a scale of 1 to 10, it can just be an emotion, a feeling, a memory, an event. The cortisol will destroy all that is not necessary for survival when they go into the second phase of the sleep, in the middle of the night, around typically around 1 to 3 o'clock. It'll begin the cathartic stage of destroying anything that doesn't need to be used for essential life. So if it's something that happens once, it's simple dissociation. Now, if it becomes repetitive, or what they would call ritualistic, it will create personalities that are more developed. In other words, if the mind knows that somebody's going to come in there and hit it, for instance, a parent that gets home from work and decides they want to slap a child around or cause the child to be afraid of being abused, it will create a personality that will then become the one that deals with that situation, since it has to interact during that time period. It will then develop that personality, and if that personality persists, um, in other words, if the trauma persists up past the age of 9, around 7 to 9, it becomes a full-blown personality. And the person will live with it to such a degree that they won't even realize they have it. That's where the denial system comes in. Polyfragmentation is not like that. Polyfragmentation is used in all mind control programming. Polyfragmentation is it's a science. It's called the kaleidoscope. If you've ever seen a kaleidoscope, it will be a whole bunch of different colors, pieces of glass or paper or plastic. And as you turn it, they create new images. Each image is new. But if you study the science of it, it will throw them around, and there will be a strict number of how many times it will create the same one, or have just little shade variations. That's why when you get into mind control programming and polyfragmentation, they will have what's called ribbon or color programming. So when they go to create the kaleidoscope, which will be the ability to create an infinitesimal, means a numberless amount of personalities, they will program them according to colors, frequencies, and what we would call cueing, not triggers, but cueing scenarios. So polyfragmentation is when an individual intentionally overrides the mind, and it begins in infancy. It begins right after the child is delivered. In the first month, they will begin working on that child to over-duress it. And what they will do is split the brain. It'll split into the left and to the right side, creating two hemispheres. And then they will train those hemispheres. And they will do this through controlled situations and scenarios. And so there will be specific ages that they split the brain because they have to allow it to develop. The brain develops in a child from just above the brainstem at the center of the cerebral fissure point, the central fissure point at the top of the brainstem, the upper 3/8. And that's the seventh layer that's called the brain box. Above that is the oasis. It's a circle, and that's where all alternate personality shells are located. It's like suitcases or finger drives that are waiting just to be plugged in, because God has created the body so that it can disassociate. Those alternate shells are there. They're empty, though. So prior to the age of 2, prior to the age of 6 months, they will split the brain into left and right, because an infant cannot pass out. It has to endure what happens. So then they will create a left and a right side, and then they will split those two sides at a different age, the right side, the left side, into two more. They will take those two and split them into 4. And so you'll have 4, 4, 4, 4. They will split each one of those 4 into 6. And then they will split those 6 into 12. That creates, and it's based upon George Boole, who's the father of mathematical science and computer science. He lived in the late 1800s before computers were ever designed. He was a mathematician, but the word psychologist wasn't around yet. And he created his theorem so that you could create an infinite number of personalities in a person. So polyfragmentation is when you create little parts. And you see that's where the 12 come in. Because each one of the 12s will be just a part of a part of a part of a part that's a part. There will be 6 layers. This is why when somebody's got mind control programming, they will often take them through several stages. For instance, if you have a beta or sexual slave, you may do here kitty kitty, and I don't mean to trigger anybody, and that will cue them to switch to the next part, which may be Bast, a female that has a cat head and a human body. But then you will give her the command and trigger her, and she may turn into a pig. Well, then that pig, in turn, when it's triggered, can turn into any number of 6 different types of animals, and then each one of those animals will have 12 parts. And so what it's called deep layer programming. And that's done so that they can control this person and use them without them ever knowing it. Because what will happen is each one of the 12, in each one of these four circles of four, they will bring these colors together like a kaleidoscope. They'll bring parts from the right side to the left side, to the right front to the left front. And when they hook them together to create a single alternate personality, when that personality is done doing its job, it will then turn back into fragments. It will separate and go back to one of its respective four regions. So they create it from four different regions of the brain: left, right, front, back, top to bottom, 6 layers from the top to the bottom to the brain box, which is the computer in the back. When the fragments come apart, so does the memory. This is why the person will have no memory of what they've done while they're if they're polyfragmented. Because it's like taking a puzzle or a picture and then cutting it into, say, 1,000 pieces and then separating those 1,000 pieces, putting 200 here, 200 here, 200 here, 200 here, separating them, and actually it would be 1,200 split into 6 regions. And those modeling centers will hold them separate. So that person never has any memory of anything that's done. And that's how they create a mind control, undetectable mind control slave. This type of research has been around for millennia. It was in the Necronomicon. There are 5 of the grimoires, and they taught how to make a mind control slave to the dung beetle, or Beelzebub, as we would call him. How they would take the mind, the heart, the soul, the spirit, the identity. They would separate the person into 7 facets. There's numbers that are used in everything. So polyfragmentation is when somebody has intentionally split the mind of a child and then split and identified, named, given colors, frequencies, verbal commands, storage, and identity to each one of those, split them again, and then split those splits again, and then split those splits again. It's deep layered programming. So we will get into in the next lecture how this is done. And the whole purpose of these lectures is so that counselors and people will learn how to reverse the shattered mind, how to put it back together. And the Lord Jesus Christ can do that through prayer. So this is Dr. Tom Knotts, and Michelle, I apologize for taking so long. My health has finally got back to where I can get into this. So Lord bless you all, and I'll see you again.